to hit record and set us up for live streaming, and we are ready to go. I'm so excited to be here with all of you tonight. As I said, I'm Betsy Moore, Director of Programs of the Jewish Women's Archive, and I am delighted to be with you tonight for our final book talk for May. Everyone, please introduce yourselves in the chat. Make sure that your chat is set to speak to everyone and not just panelists. And throughout the program, please put your questions in the chat so that we can bring them into our conversation. Before we begin our conversation, I want to say a few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We take an intersectional approach to Jewish history and culture because we believe that uncovering a more diverse story helps us understand the world we live in and create a better future. This book talk will give you a glimpse into some of our resources, but I hope that you will check out jwa.org to explore the many other projects and resources that we offer. I am now thrilled to introduce tonight's author and guest moderator. Cindy Rizzo has published 4 novels, including The Papercutter, which is the first book in a trilogy set after the first generation comes of age after the US splits into 2 countries. The second book, The Border Crosser, will be released in September. Cindy's first novel, Exception to the Rule, won the 2014 Debut Author Award from the Golden Crown Literary Society. Cindy has had a long career in social justice philanthropy and is currently the head of the LGBTQ social justice program at the Arcus Foundation. She serves on the board of SAGE, the nation's only organization serving and advocating for LGBTQ elders, and is a member of Congregation Beit Simchat Torah. Cindy and her wife reside in New York City. I'm also delighted to introduce our guest moderator tonight. Idit Klein is the president and CEO of Keshet, the National Organization for LGBTQ Equality in Jewish Life, and recently celebrated her 20th anniversary at this incredible organization. She serves on the advisory board of the Safety, Respect, and Equity Coalition and the leadership team of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable to strengthen the national Jewish social justice movement. Idit was honored by JWA with a Women Who Dared Award, as well as by Jewish Women International with a Women to Watch Award, and was selected for the Forward 50, a list of American Jews who have made enduring contributions to public life. She lives in Boston with her family. Idit and Cindy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Betsy. Unmuted. Okay, it's only been 2.5 years of Zoom and still getting into practice. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to JWA for inviting me to be here tonight. As I have shared directly with Cindy, but I'm delighted to tell all of you, I absolutely loved this book. I just inhaled it. I stayed up all night reading it. I couldn't put it down. I fell in love with the characters and was totally transfixed by the story. So it's really a treat to get to moderate this conversation tonight. So Cindy, I would love to start out by asking you what inspired you to write The Papercutter?
I think I was following the news and really worried about the increasing polarization of the country, of the US. And it seemed to be getting worse. And I would read sort of statistics like they have this idea of the landslide counties. And landslide counties are counties where one or the other presidential candidate, either the Democrat or the Republican, won the county by over 20%. And for each presidential election year, the number of those landslide counties had increased, so that more and more of the counties in the United States were either all red or all blue. And so that was just an incredible data point for me as I thought about it. And so then I had this thought experiment, like, well, what would happen? Would we have to split the country? And what would it look like if we did? And so that's kind of the genesis of the thinking behind The Papercutter.
Wonderful. Well, I'm sure that among the increasing by the moment participants who are with us tonight. There are those who have had the pleasure of reading it, the thrill of reading it, and those who haven't yet. So for those who haven't yet, would you share a short excerpt with us to give people a sense of the energy and tone, and then we'll dive right back into more questions.
Sure. So let me start by saying that the map behind me is my concept of what the United States would look like if it's split. You couldn't split it in half just because of where the polarization occurs. So you have all of the red plus Alaska are the God-fearing states, which is one of the new countries, and then the east part of the U.S. and the far west and Hawaii are the United Progressive Regions. And so I'm going to read from the first chapter a little bit to introduce you to the character who is actually the Papercutter, Judith Braverman, and just give you a little bit of a background about how the split came about and introduce you to how Judith feels about it. So after decades of increasing polarization, the United States of America became ungovernable and split itself into two nations. Each state joined one of the new countries, the God-fearing states of America, a majority white Christian conservative nation, and the United Progressive Regions of America, a majority non-white liberal nation, except Ohio, which was split in two. And this book takes place in North Ohio and South Ohio. So we begin with Judith. I sit confined in the hardwood classroom desk, an uncomfortable chair attached to a writing surface. Mrs. Kastenbaum is droning on about the history of the God-fearing states. When I stare directly at her, trying to get a fix on her soul, it neither shows up as shimmering with goodness nor hollowed out with malevolence. Unfortunately, not everyone shows their true soul to me. Mine is an imperfect gift from Hashem. It's a gift that enables me to see the soul, the neshama of some, but not others. Maybe Hashem thinks there's no reason for me to see Mrs. Kastenbaum's soul. I turn my attention to the design for a paper cut I'd started thinking about for the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. There has to be an image I could use that's more creative than the standard ones of fruits and vegetables or dining in a sukkah. But what? Hannah Goldwyn, the Second Constitutional Convention took place where? I snapped to attention at the mention of my best friend's name. Charleston, South Carolina? Okay, Hannah is safe. 11th grade marks a decade during which we've had to sit through some form of this lecture. Because tomorrow is GFS Independence Day, all schools, even the religious ones like Kushner Academy for Girls, are required by the government to teach a lesson about the establishment of the country. When we were younger, they gave us the easy stuff. One year we had to color in the map of the GSF and UPR, red for us and blue for them. I remember thinking I felt bad for the other country because they were separated into two sections. That whole part on the left side, which I later learned is their western region, sits by itself, separated from its blue brothers and by a big part of our country. Of course, our own state of Alaska is separated, but that's the only one state. All the other GFS states form one big red piece from the shore of North Carolina to the border with Mexico and up to a piece of the border with Canada. Ours is the bigger country. Mrs. Kastenbaum walks right by my desk, her booming voice shaking me into a state of alert. And what great doctrine was adopted at the Charleston Convention? Yetta? Yetta Freundlich, the insufferable smart aleck who never lets you forget that she knows everything. I'd long ago seen her neshama, and since then have kept my distance from that hollowed-out soul. Yetta speaks as if she's the one teaching the class, loud and confident, carefully enunciating each word. The United States of America adopted the Texas Plan, which prohibited the former USA federal government from overturning state laws. Correct. Mrs. Kastenbaum pushes out a smile that disappears in a split second. And what happened in the wake of the assassinations that followed? Yetta's hand shoots up, her body straining to catapult out of her seat. I glance over at Hannah, who rolls her eyes. Okay, Yetta again, says Mrs. Kastenbaum, her voice weary. The government canceled the presidential election, and instead the third constitutional convention was held so that the former United States of America could be divided into two new countries. She holds her head erect, looks straight ahead into the distance, and continues, her voice even more arrogant than usual. Our God-fearing states, which stand for faith and freedom, and the other one, which stands for atheistic anarchy. I stopped listening and returned to planning my paper cut, twirling a finger through my dark curly hair. I wonder if I can improve on the design I created last June for Shavuot. It was the typical image of Moses at the top of Mount Sinai, speaking to Hashem. Could a human really stand before God and have an actual conversation? I know it's a death sentence to look him in the face, but a conversation? Judith Braverman, are you with us? Judith? Mrs. Castenbaum's stern voice pulls me off Mount Sinai and back into the classroom. Since I have no idea what I've been asked, there is only one thing to do. My body tenses as I take a deep breath. Could you repeat the question? Mrs. Castenbaum sighs, one of those dramatic ones that broadcasts exasperation. Judith, I won't have inattentiveness in my classroom. Do I make myself clear? I nod, but am still faced with a steely glare, and quickly realize why. I haven't appropriately expressed the right amount of remorse. Yes, Mrs. Castenbaum, it won't happen again. See that it doesn't, or there'll be a demerit and detention. The glare is gone, replaced by Mrs. Castenbaum gazing up at the ceiling in thought, her hands behind her back. Oh yes, now I recall. She looks at me not quite so steely this time. What was the Great Migration? I exhale with relief because I know the acceptable answer, but I also know about the book that Hannah found hidden in the public library when she was trying to find information for a paper on Jewish immigration to the USA during the early part of the last century. She told me the book she found was wedged against the back of the bookcase, its binding facing the wall. She saw it when she pulled out a few books she thought she'd need for her paper and tugged on it until it was free of the bookcase. When she saw that the title mentioned the Great Migration, she thought it had been shelved incorrectly until she took a closer look. It turned out the book wasn't at all about the 2 years after the split when people resettled into the GFS and UPR. It was a book about the migration of Black people from the southern part of the USA to the north during the 1900s. There was no barcode or sticker from the library on the spine, so Hannah wouldn't be able to check it out. It made us wonder if someone had left it there, hidden away. When Hannah snuck the book out of the library and showed it to me later, I first marveled at the beauty of the title, The Warmth of Other Suns. But then I suddenly understood the real message of the book. So there was another Great Migration before the one after the split, I asked. Seems so, and it's not too hard to figure out why they never told us about that one. I nodded, struck by the realization of how little we knew about the people who'd lived in the USA and who had left their homes a second time for the warmth of other suns. I've never met anyone Black, I said to Hannah. Have you? She shook her head, her long wavy brown hair shifting from left to right and back again. And we've been told nothing about them or their history. I fanned the pages of the book, listening to the tick, tick, tick of the sounds they made. I guess we should read this then, right? Hannah breathed out her response. Yeah. She reached over and gently took the book from me. Makes you wonder what else they're not telling us. None of what I now know about the original Great Migration can be repeated to Mrs. Castenbaum if I want to pass her class. Instead, I need to tell her exactly what she wants to hear. The Great Migration took place after the split when people made the decision to settle in either the God-fearing states or the United Progressive Regions. And which populations moved where? She snaps back at me. I think for a few seconds, deciding it might be best to say something that would get me back into her good graces. After our country's military put an end to riots and uprisings, they were able to oversee the orderly resettlement of the two new countries. Once it was safe, Orthodox and Hasidic Jews living in parts of the UPR moved to the GFS for religious liberty, as did evangelical Christians. Then Blacks, Hispanics, and Muslims living in our country moved or were moved to the UPR, along with leftists and atheists. Kastenbaum nods. You got lucky this time, Miss Braverman. I would suggest you not let your artistic daydreams get the better of you. My nod is punctuated by the bell, jolting everyone into action. Fortunately, tomorrow is a holiday, a welcome reprieve from this torture. Smiling to myself, I slide books and pens into my bag, grateful for the end of the school day. Hey, says Hannah as she waits for me to finish. Holiday tomorrow. She nudges my shoulder. I stand and lean closer so nobody else can hear. Now that's what I call religious liberty, I whisper. That's it.
It is very chilling. So you all, for those of you who haven't had the chance to read the Papercutter yet, you just met Judith and were introduced to the God-fearing states and through her perspective to the other country as well. And of course, in the Papercutter, we see the polarization that you spoke about earlier, Cindy, taken to its most logical and extreme outcome. I think that I'm sure I'm not the only one on this call who, in recent weeks has wondered, if perhaps, such a scenario could in fact be in our future. And I think this kind of world perhaps feels painfully, potentially relevant, much more so than ever before. So I'm interested to hear, in particular, in light of recent events related to the Supreme Court specifically, how do you think about the world that you created within the pages of the Papercutter in relation to the world as we see around us?
Well, I mean, it's chilling. People have asked me, is this what you want to have happen? And I don't think I do. I mean, I just think that it's too scary. What would become of the country that I've called the God-fearing states, and how extreme it would get. And in the second book that's coming in September, we start to see the extremism getting worse. Especially for Jews, because Jews were really in this setting were the only ones to stay in the God-fearing states. There were very few other non-Christian white populations that settled there. So the Jews become the scapegoats, as we often do. And so anti-Semitism is a very big theme in this trilogy. And that's what I would, certainly be afraid of. We just saw what happened in Buffalo, and certainly it was a horrible act of hate violence against African Americans. But when you looked at the manifesto that this guy wrote, he also talked about killing Jews. So there's just the hate, it just goes across all differences. And so, it's a chilling kind of situation. And I do fear about what's going on, because I think at the same time that we have this escalation of hate, we also have this attack on democracy. And, we're at a very precarious time in our country's history.
So let's go into that a little more deeply. One of the elements of your book that I appreciated is how it's a book that is rooted in Jewish characters, in both states, but which really shows the intersections among anti-Semitism and misogyny and racism and xenophobia and so again, moving from the Papercutter to American society today, thinking just of the tragic events, of the recent week rather, how do you see the links amongst, all of these kinds of, systemic oppression?
Yeah, no, I mean, they're incredibly related. I mean, the people, as I said before, the people that are haters, hate across all differences. So you'll have, they'll hate all people of color. And this falls very heavily on African Americans, as we saw in Buffalo, but also the increase in anti-Asian violence. that we've also seen, and that also we saw some examples, unfortunately, of last week as well in Dallas, Texas, and in Southern California. So these things span all folks who are people of color, and also they certainly impact the Jewish community. There are many incidents, and there's a spike of anti-Semitic violence as well. Certainly those who are Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, Haredi are more visible and are easier, in a sense, more visible targets for this kind of hate. But it happens to LGBT people. We see the murder of transgender folks and the anti-trans laws that are coming up in some of these states that would be part of the GFS. And it's a very scary time. This is pushback. This is very, very bad right now. And we just don't know right now where it's going, and especially with the Supreme Court the way it is, with the possible overturning of Roe versus Wade, and the impact of that decision, as bad as it is in and of itself, on other decisions that had upheld a right to privacy. So we're really sort of on the precipice right now, and it's very scary, and it makes this book feel even more of a possibility than it did when I wrote it.
The question just came in the chat. What does GFS stands for?
It's the God-fearing states.
God-fearing states.
Right, yeah.
Like the parallel to today's red states.
That's right.
At a more logical, at even more of an extreme than their current incarnation. So there is, I agree, so much to be frightened of. We see it in the pages of the Papercutter, and we see it manifested in ways that seem not too far from the pages of your book, in reality today. So let's shift for a moment, from what fills us with fear to places from which we can draw some hope. There is so much hope and so much power and real exuberance amongst the young people of the Papercutter. So I'd love to hear from you when you think about the wisdom of the young people you brought to life in the pages of your book. What do you think we can draw? What should we draw from their wisdom to our lives today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing, and even in that little snippet that I just read, is their ability to question and whether they're being told the truth. I think that's the first sort of thing that dawns on them before they're moved to action. Is the world I've been given or told about the real world? Is this really happening? So this idea of finding the book, The Warmth of Other Suns, and really learning about African American history. And I think that begins a lot of questioning, and then they start talking to one another, and it builds from there. And that's what we see as the Papercutter moves toward the end, that sort of arc of change among these kids who are Orthodox Jewish kids and were raised in this country. They didn't know anything else. And then they start to see some things that really worry them. And they see some of the adults, not all of the adults, but some of the adults in their community going along with it, feeling like each, tightening of the metaphorical noose isn't a problem, doesn't bother them. And these kids are sort of, saying, what? This is horrible. We have to do something about this. And that, that's what young people bring to all social movements. They're sort of they're like the canaries in the coal mine. They're the warning symbol. And that's how I put them in this book and in the ones that follow, and how important they are.
As I got to know the youth in your book, I kept thinking of actual queer Jewish youth, who I've met through our work at Keshet, because we work directly with queer Jewish youth. And I kept kind of seeing the courage that I see real live youth today, exhibiting in the face of unsupportive parents, unsupportive schools, hostile state legislatures. And so I'm curious, did you draw these characters from kind of real live queer Jewish youth in your lives, or was it entirely from your imagination?
Yeah, the kids in the God-fearing states in Southern Ohio were mostly from my imagination. Those are the kids that had to go through the most change and were in the most challenging environment and oppressive environment. The young people in the United Progressive Regions, which I have three narrators in the book: Judith, who you've met, uh, Danny Fine, who is the character that is from the United Progressive Regions, and she's openly gay. She lives in a country that is a majority people of color country. Her friends are of all different races, all different sexual orientations and gender identities. She just lives in this diverse world. And I see, a lot of kids that I know and know of having that kind of social life and social structure in terms of their friend groups. So I think I drew on Danny a lot from my understanding of a lot of young kids today. The third narrator is Jeffrey Schwartz, and Jeffrey has is scared. He knows he's gay. He's very deeply in the closet. This is a country that will send you to a conversion camp if someone finds out that you're gay. So it is not in his best interest at all to be out. And he's bullied and he's teased, and he has a lot of growth to go through, and he does in the course of these books.
There are a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. I'll share them together because one is a quick one. Question: is this a YA novel or is it aimed at adults? And so many Jews are fleeing from the cold and or retiring to southern states. Do you think that changing demography will shift the power in the GFS?
Yeah, I would say on the first one, yes, it's a young adult novel. That's pretty much the genre I wrote it in, but I think it has a lot of crossover appeal because of the issues that it's dealing with. So I think even though the narrators are 17-year-old teenagers, the context in which the book takes place really is something that I think adults will be engaged with. So I don't think the fact that it's a YA book really would detract from that.
And I'll share just that I read it when I read it several months ago when I was 48 at the time. And I don't generally read young adult novels. They don't generally appeal to me. But as I said before, I couldn't put it down. So a recommendation from one person.
In terms of the other one, in terms of where Jews are moving, you have to ask which Jews. Because what we saw in Brooklyn during the 2020 presidential election was very growing support for Trump among the Haredi community. And then I started reading articles about many of these folks in these communities moving to Florida because they felt that they wouldn't have mask mandates, they could congregate in large numbers. Some of the constraints that they felt were constraints that were really public health measures to keep everyone healthy were motivated them to relocate. So you really have to ask, who is moving where? You can't say all Jews. You have to say which, are they the more conservative? Florida is a really interesting state because Florida was a purple state for a long time. And now, because of the governor and because of who's living there, not just the ultra-Orthodox Jews, but a lot of older retired people who are very conservative, it's become a bright red state. It just recently passed some horrible laws, the Don't Say Gay or Trans law. You can't protest in front of people's homes. Hopefully that one gets knocked down by the courts. Many, many laws that he's put in place with the blessing of the legislature. So Florida, and that's where a lot of folks have moved. So I don't know. I don't have a lot of hope around the idea of migration into the red states. It could happen, and maybe North Carolina. We're seeing a little bit of hope in Georgia and Arizona, but to me, the jury's out on those states. I'm not sure. At one point, Ohio was more purple than it is now. It's red. So a lot of this is in flux, and it's hard to know.
And in the comments, someone noted that indeed many progressive and liberal folks are currently fleeing Florida.
Yeah, which is sad because
that's a phenomenon too.
Yeah.
So going back to thinking about the young people in the book, I know from an earlier conversation that you and I had some time ago, Cindy, that while you were working on the Papercutter, you were at the same time reading biographies of Jewish teens who were living in Poland in the 1930s. Did you draw from their stories, into the stories of the young people in the God-fearing states, or just in general? Did that inform the plot of the Papercutter?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because it's such an interesting thing, and I really would encourage people to look into it. In the 1930s, YIVO sponsored a contest, which is the Yiddishkeit Institute, Research Institute, and they sponsored a contest that asked Jewish youth, most of whom spoke Yiddish as their first language, to write their biographies and do it anonymously. They could make up names, whatever. They just wanted to know what the lives of young Jewish people were like. So they said it was a contest. And so they would get all these biographies and someone would win. And so they got hundreds and hundreds of these submissions from young people. And unfortunately, and as soon as I tell you the date of when they were supposed to announce the winner, you'll know why this contest never came to fruition. They were supposed to announce the winner on September 1st, 1939, which was the day the Nazis invaded Poland. The contest was never completed. And many of the, and this was, of course, in Vilna, which was the heart of Jewish education and life and research. And when the Nazis came into Vilna, they went through YIVO's research and all of their materials, some of which got saved because it was hidden, some of which got sent to Germany, and then some of that was later retrieved. But eventually they found some of these biographies that kids had written. And there's a book about them. And then recently, this wonderful graphic novel was made that looked at 6 of their lives. And I've been to webinars and read about this a lot. And what I took away from it that really informed the writing of the Papercutter and the books that follow it is the idea that these young people, they were teenagers, very much the same as the ones in my book. They were living at a time of escalating anti-Semitism, of a threat from Germany, of their own Polish neighbors getting worse and worse in terms of their treatment of Jews. Some of them had to be kicked out of school, were kicked out of schools, things like that. But their lives, while they wrote about all that, they were also writing about who was dating who had a crush on who, what social group they were part of, what political group, who was a Bundist, who was a socialist, who was a Zionist, and why would you go to one and not the other? And is there that because there's a cute boy there or a cute girl there? Some of them talked about their same-sex relationships or attractions. And perennial that you'll all, are acquainted with is they were rebelling against their parents. Their parents were very old school religious. They wanted to tell them who they should marry. They were very clear about things like that. And these kids were modern kids. They didn't want any of that. So there was that generation gap that we're all familiar with in different generations and different eras, but all of that was there. And it really made me realize that when you write about teenagers, you have to do both things. You have to write about this political context, this horrible thing that's happening, and you also have to think about who they like, what happened, who's being mean to them, who's being nice to them, their insecurities, all of those things. It's all one and the same for their lives. And that was, that was really instructive for me in writing this book.
I love that. So what do you hear from teens, whether Jewish or not, who read the Papercutter? How do they respond to the book?
I've had some really positive feedback. Some people really, really liked it. I actually, I use beta readers when I have a manuscript before it goes to my editor. And for the second book called The Border Crosser, I had actually a 13-year-old read my book. And she gave me some really good feedback. I made some changes based on what she said. So I'm feeling very good about that in terms of the response that I've had from young people and from adults as well.
Did you start out conceiving of the Papercutter as the first of a trilogy? Is that how you imagined the story?
I knew I had to finish the story. I didn't know what that meant until I was really way through the Papercutter and realized that not only does this have to be a trilogy, I have three main characters. And in many ways, the Papercutter really is about Judith Braverman, because she is the Papercutter, and we follow her in, very closely. The Border Crosser is about Danny Fine, and the changes she goes through. And the third, as yet unnamed book, will be the completion of Jeffrey's arc of change. And what Judith discovers about him in the Papercutter sort of comes to fruition in the third book. So that book I'm in the middle of writing right now.
Wow. So without giving anything away for those who haven't read the Papercutter yet, why a Papercutter? Why paper cutting as to play such a central and defining role in the book?
I wanted Judith to have a talent, something that set her apart. And paper cutting is such a wonderful, very culturally Jewish and religiously Jewish craft that really, she's not a highly social person. She's very happy sitting at her art desk for hours and hours. She hasn't thought about romantic relationships. She has one best friend, Hannah, and her life is very settled in that way. She really cares about her art. She doesn't like school, which is what you all heard when I read that part. That's where she starts out, but she's incredibly she's a very advanced artist for her age. And she also has this weird mystical gift of seeing the souls of some people. And that, if anything, that troubles her. That kind of pulls her out of that placid existence she has, because she doesn't understand it and she doesn't understand why that happens. And when she sees Jeffrey's soul, she doesn't understand what she's seen because it's different from any other ones. So her journey is about coming into all of that and learning. My friend Yvonne Marzuk, who's on here today and wrote this wonderful young adult book called The Prophetess, her theme is growing into your gifts. And Judith Braverman is growing into her gifts in the Papercutter. And I also would recommend The Prophetess to anyone who wants to read more Jewish young adult books. It's a wonderful book.
Beautiful. Thank you for that recommendation. So a question from the chat. Someone said, I thought the art of paper cutting came from Asian countries. Can you speak to that?
It may have originated there, but Judith tells the story that she learned in school that a rabbi was writing and there was no heat or anything in those days, and it was the middle of winter, and his inkwell froze. So he started cutting into the paper all of the Hebrew Hebrew letters that he was writing. And that kind of began the Jewish art of paper cutting. It's a little like, this is a weird comparison, so stay with me. It's a little like Mahjong. Mahjong is very Asian in its conception and its history, but it also has this whole Jewish history. And I think paper cutting in some ways is similar.
I think we can say these and these are both true in this case.
That's right. Both and.
All right. So another question from the chat says, I understand that volume 2 is complete and coming out soon. And you mentioned, Cindy, that you are in the midst of volume 3. Are you concerned what the political climate will be here when it's finished?
I'm always concerned about the political climate, whether it's finished or not. And as I said, things start getting worse for the Jews in the God-fearing states in the border crosser. You know, at the same time that all of these teenage relationships are moving forward and all their kind of drama. And it also, in the border crosser, there's a lot more of that sort of teen organizing separate from adults and in a way of rebellion. But there's also, I would say that the border crosser is a more religious book than the Papercutter in terms of the way that these folks who are part of this resistance are trying to maintain their faith and think about new ways. And Dani herself is trying to reconcile what it means for her to be Jewish. So there's a lot more of that in the border crosser than there was in the Papercutter.
What else can you tell us about what to expect in the border crosser?
Well, there's going to be a new teenage character, and who's a more well, he's a twin, and his fraternal twin. He has his twin sister. She's more in the background. He's more prominent, and he's also quite a bit of a rebel. So a new character from the United Progressive Regions. And we see Dani having to deal with her parents more. And her mother is a force to be contended with. So we get to see that quite a bit. And as I said, you know, it's her, this is her volume and what she goes through and what she sees. And I think that, you know, in that regard, it'll be interesting to what people think about that.
Okay, I guess you're gonna leave it at that for all of us. That's entirely fair. So, you know, given how real all of these issues are, you know, for adults, what made you decide to make this a YA novel? You know, clearly a YA novel that, you know, has crossover appeal, but it's, you know, squarely aimed, you know, at the young adult audience.
Yeah. I was reading a lot of YA, and I had written a few short stories that were YA, and I started to really get comfortable with the genre and interested in it. I've always liked, like, you know, some teen movies. It's just sort of a time of life that is so interesting to me. People who are really becoming who they are and dealing with issues of identity, and being true to themselves, and, you know, making a lot of mistakes along the way. And it to me, it's just a really interesting time of life for young people. I think the whole years of my first book took place in a college setting, which is an extension of that whole time of teenagerhood. It's sort of that late part of it. And it's also a time when people are, you know, young people are away from their parents if they go away to college, and they have to deal with what their lives are like on their own and everything. So that whole sort of idea of growing up was interesting to me. And I thought, because I wanted to talk about resistance and rebellion, who better to see it through, whose eyes better to see it through than teenagers.
Can Can you define, the question was just sent to me privately by someone. Can you define what's unique to a YA novel?
I think it's about the character's arc of change and their own coming into their identity and themselves and what they have to do, and the beginning to separate from their parents. And there's certainly more engagement with their parents, whether that's rebellion or other kinds of relationship issues that they have. So, and it's usually told from the point of view of a teenager. It's always told from the point of view. And they're, in a sense, the heroes of the book, the heroes and heroines of the book. So I think that is what is usually defined. Those are the qualities of YA.
I would assume, but correct me if I'm wrong, that there aren't a whole lot of YA novels written from the perspective of queer Jewish teens. So that's another way that this novel is special.
Yeah, there's a few. I've been looking at them, even just Jewish teens. And another one I can recommend that I read this year is The City Beautiful. That's a historical YA novel, and the main character's a gay boy, and he comes as an immigrant from, I believe, Russia to the United States, and ends up in Chicago on his own because his father dies on the way in the ship, and it's a lot about the immigrant experience during that time. And it was the time of the Chicago World's Fair at the end of the 19th century, and it's fascinating and really, really good. I recommend that one in addition to the other one that I mentioned.
Wonderful. Another question from the chat. People are wondering if this book or other books that you've written could potentially be banned or canceled in some of the states, such as Florida, where the Don't Say Gay, Don't Say Trans law has been passed.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I mean, if you look at the list of the books that have been banned or challenged, many of them have LGBT content or characters. A lot of them are about trans or gender identity issues. Even Melinda Lowe's book Last Night at the Telegraph Club, which is a YA book that won the National Book Award for Young Adult Fiction, was also on a list of books in Texas that were challenged. And it's a lovely historical book. So, I mean, I don't see why I would be left off of those lists, or anything that I've written would be. They tend to be focused on books that would be of interest to teenagers, obviously, because they think that they're protecting kids, or they're allowing parents to make these decisions. But it's all very it all contradicts itself. On the one hand, they think parents should be making decisions about curriculum and books. And on the other hand, when parents try to make decisions about healthcare for their transgender kids, that all of a sudden they're not allowed to do. So, all of this is ridiculous, and it's all sort of a smokescreen for an agenda that's really about who can stay in power and who would be out of power. And I think that we all have to recognize that and see how connected all of these issues are. It's not just about one community or one identity. It's really all across the board.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A children's book that Keshet helped get published called The Purim Superhero, which is just a Purim story in which the main character has an Abba and a daddy, has two fathers, was just banned in a school district in Florida. So not a list one wants to be on, but a list which one finds oneself in good company, sadly.
Yeah. I mean, one of the banned books ended up being a bestseller because there was so much attention called to it. I mean, that's kind of the irony of this. But as you're right, it's not a list you want to be on.
Right. So as we near the end of our time together, I'd love to move to thinking about where you draw hope in these times that are challenging for so many reasons. A time of so much uncertainty in which there's so much that is daunting that we face. where do you draw hope in your own life? And do you see the Papercutter and from what you can share from the Border Crosser, are there hopeful messages in these books that
Yes.
readers can take forward?
Yeah. No, I think it's really important to be thinking about what's hopeful, because you can be in a permanent state of depression reading the news. I do think that the ability of these characters and their friends, the sort of secondary characters, to recognize what's going on, to see the true picture of it, and to organize and become part of a resistance is really what I think we have to hold on to. That there are people who see what's happening and are doing something about it and are drawing a line and saying, no, I'm not part of this. I'm not participating in this. I'm going to push against it. And I see that, certainly that's the positive note that the Papercutter ends on. And I think we see some of that positivity continue into the Border Crosser. I mean, there's scary stuff that happens in the Border Crosser for sure, but there's also just incredible creativity and ingenuity among these kids and the adults with them who are really trying to survive in a world and really figure out their way of keeping themselves safe and flourishing. So yes, that's really what's at the bottom of these books. It's really what's important. So, oh, someone asked who wrote the Telegraph Club. Melinda Lowe, L-O is her last name. She's a very well-known young adult author and very good.
Well, thank you so much for being in conversation with me tonight. Thank you for bringing these really wondrous, powerful people to life. After I finished the Papercutter, I thought about all of the main characters for days and just wanted more time with them. So I'm excited to be reunited with them in the Border Crosser and then again in book 3. So I will look forward to snatching them from the bookshelves once they become available.
And let me thank you, because you've been such a real supporter of this book, and I so appreciate it. And I was thrilled to hear that you and I would be in conversation. So I've really enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Thank you both so much. This was such a delightful conversation. I loved hearing more about this amazing book. And I love the conversation about YA. When we were creating our book list for this year, we were somewhat surprised to find that we actually had an unusually high number of books aimed at young people on our list. We've had QBTs with some of them already. We actually had a panel with middle grade authors about writing for this age. So we've had Wendy Wanlong Shang and Madeline Rosenberg, Amy Lucido, Emily Barth Eisler, as well as your book, and possibly more that I'm forgetting because I'm going off the top of my head. So I think that it's a genre that has just really flourished as a place for people to grapple with these kinds of really meaty questions in a way that feels urgent. So thank you. I really appreciate that aspect.
Well, I would love to come back for the Border Crosser if you'll have me.
Please.
That would be great.
Wonderful. Yes, please do let us know as soon as it's out.
Great.
And if I also may shamelessly toot my own horn, I just wrote a piece for JWA about finding hope in these times last week. So I will share that link in the chat in case it helps anyone. But thank you. This has been absolutely wonderful. This closes our May QBT series, but it is only a few weeks before our June online history course will start. And this one's going to be really fun. It's going to be on the history of Jewish women in film and television. I'm really excited. It will begin on June 1st. And I'm sorry, June 2nd, not June 1st, on Thursdays, as always, with our fearless leader, Judith Rosenbaum, back as moderator. So we are all really looking forward for that. To that, I encourage everyone who's interested to learn more about it and register at the links in the chat. And with that, I will say good night. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It was such a pleasure.
Thank